In the autumn of 1271, off a jagged, uncharted coast, an English naval squadron vanished. This was not the work of pirates, nor the wrath of a storm. Official Admiralty records, sealed for nearly 600 years, describe a battle against an impossible foe. They tell of a morning when the sea fell silent and the sky turned the color of lead. They speak of a fleet firing its cannons at a target that absorbed the shot without a mark, a colossal, shifting form that rose from the depths and dismantled their ships not with malice, but with a terrifying indifference. This is the story of that encounter, a classified event so paradigm-shifting, its only surviving record concludes with the captain's chilling, handwritten epitaph: "We tried to fight something that does not believe in war." If you believe the abyss still holds secrets that can rewrite history, then join our expedition. The Maritime Chronicler is dedicated to unearthing the suppressed files and forbidden logs of nautical history. Subscribe and report for duty in the comments by telling us where on the globe you are joining our voyage from. Together, we will navigate the truly unknown. The year is 1271. King Henry III's grip on the English throne, though long, was often tenuous, secured as much by weary tradition as by true strength. Yet even in such times, the crown's reach stretched far, particularly across the restless waters that guarded its island dominion. For centuries, the English fleet had been the sinews of its power, a floating bulwark against raiding Norsemen, ambitious French princes, and the unpredictable whims of the sea itself. Their purpose? To patrol, to protect, to project the king's will into the churning expanse. Among these wooden titans, none was more formidable than the HMS Ironclad. Not in the sense of the later steel behemoths, no, but in the stoutness of her oak timbers, the heavy iron-strapped prow, and the sheer brutal efficiency of her design. She was a carrack, broad-beamed and deep-bellied, built to weather the Channel's notorious temper and to carry a formidable complement of men and arms. Her sails, patched and sun-bleached, were the color of forgotten parchment, yet they held the wind with an almost defiant grace. Her decks, worn smooth by 1,000 boots, knew the rhythmic slap of the waves and the constant comforting groan of stressed wood. At her helm, often, stood Captain Thomas Redmayne, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-scoured lines and salt-etched wrinkles, his eyes the color of a winter sea, sharp and knowing. Redmayne was a mariner of the old breed, pragmatic, unyielding, a man who trusted the stars more than kings and the sea more than men. He'd weathered tempests that had sent lesser vessels to the seabed, outsmarted pirates in fog-choked straits, and navigated by instinct where charts failed. His crew, a hardened assembly of men from the coastal towns of Sussex and Kent, followed him not out of blind obedience, but from a profound, earned respect. They knew his hand on the tiller was steady, his judgment sound, and his resolve unshakable. This autumn, the Ironclad was part of a small squadron, dispatched to patrol the often contested waters off a remote, craggy stretch of coast, a place then unnamed on any map, now known to us as the Rocks of Dolor. Their mission was routine: to deter any lingering French privateers, to assert English dominion, and to ensure the safe passage of merchant vessels returning laden with the bounty of the continent. The days had fallen into a familiar rhythm: the creak of the rigging, the distant cries of gulls, the scent of tar and brine, the murmuring prayers at dawn, the hearty, often crude banter of the men. Below decks, the cook fires glowed, and the air was thick with the smell of stale ale and simmering stew. It was a world of hard work and simple certainties, where the greatest fear was a sudden gale or a lurking shoal, and the enemy always had a name and a face. They were sailors, men of the sea, who understood its moods, its dangers, and its occasional brutal justice. They knew its limits, or so they thought. Little did they know, as the Ironclad cut her steady course through the indifferent waves, that the very fabric of their understanding was about to be torn asunder. The routine, the certainty, the familiar, comforting world of wind and tide and timber was poised on the precipice of an encounter with something that defied all their hard-won knowledge. Something the sea had held secret for millennia, waiting for a moment to rise and shatter the fragile illusion of human mastery. The morning of October 17, 1271 dawned with an unsettling beauty. The sky, usually a canvas of scudding clouds or the fierce bright blue of a challenging day, was a flawless, almost unnerving pale gray, like polished pewter. Not a wisp of cloud marred its expanse, nor did the sun, a faint, indifferent disk, offer any warmth. The air, typically brisk and salty off this particular stretch of coast, grew heavy, still, and strangely close. It felt less like the open ocean and more like the inside of a vast, unbreathing chamber. Below, the sea mirrored the sky. The usual restless chop, the rhythmic swell that was the ocean's constant breath, simply vanished. The waves, which had been their constant companion, pushing them onward or playfully buffeting their sails, seemed to sigh one last mournful breath and then vanished. The water became unnaturally smooth, a vast, dark mirror reflecting the muted sky with chilling precision. It was as if the very surface of the world had decided to hold its breath. On the decks of the HMS Ironclad, the change was palpable. The rhythmic creak and groan of her timbers, usually a comforting lullaby to the sailors, now sounded amplified, almost accusatory, in the profound silence. The sails, which had been drawing taut and full just moments before, now hung limp and useless, like the wings of a dying bird, their canvas slack against the masts. The ship, once a living, breathing entity cutting through the waves, now wallowed in the sudden, oppressive calm, her momentum dying, her purpose lost. Captain Redmayne, ever attuned to the subtle language of the sea, felt the shift first. He stood upon his quarterdeck, his keen eyes the color of glacial ice, scanning the unbroken horizon. He sniffed the air, a habit ingrained from decades at sea. It was cold, yes, but there was something else. A faint, almost imperceptible odor, like ancient disturbed earth, and something metallic, like old blood, yet different, more primal. He frowned, his red brows furrowing. Odd, he muttered to his first mate, a hulking bear of a man named Gareth. The sea holds its breath, Gareth. I like it not. Gareth, a man of few words but immense strength, merely grunted, his own gaze sweeping the empty ocean. The gulls, those ever-present squawking companions of any seafaring voyage, were nowhere to be seen. It was as if they had been erased from the sky. The men on deck, mending nets or sharpening knives, fell silent too, their banter dying on their lips as the eerie quiet seeped into their bones. They felt it, this unnatural stillness, this profound absence of the familiar. Superstition, a constant undercurrent in a sailor's life, began to coil in their guts. Whispers began to circulate, hushed and fearful. The sea is too calm. The air is too still. The gulls have fled. Then a new sound, or rather a sensation, began to manifest. A low, almost sub-audible hum, a vibration that seemed to travel not through the air, but through the very timbers of the ship, up through the soles of their boots and into their chests. It was a resonant thrum, deep and ancient, like the stirring of some colossal, submerged engine, or the slow, ponderous pulse of a titan's heart beneath the world. It grew, subtly at first, then with an increasing, bone-jarring intensity, making the very planks of the ironclad sing with an unsettling, alien melody. This was not the familiar groan of a ship in heavy seas. This was something else, something from the sea, something alive and impossibly vast, stirring below. And as the hum intensified, the water around the ironclad began to behave strangely. It wasn't choppy, nor was it swelling in the usual manner of the open ocean. Instead, great oily patches began to appear, as if the sea itself were bruised. The surface would bulge upwards in one area, then subside, only to rise again in another, as if some colossal lung were breathing ponderously beneath them. The ironclad began to drift, slowly, inexorably, towards the source of the growing disturbance, drawn by an unseen current, a silent, terrifying magnet. The men looked at each other, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a dawning dread they could not yet name. The sea, their familiar, often brutal home, was about to reveal a secret it had kept for an eternity. The humming vibration intensified, shaking the very teeth in their heads, rattling the cannonballs in their racks. The oily patches on the water's surface grew wider, darker, coalescing into a vast, inky blackness directly ahead of the HMS Ironclad. It was a patch of absolute void against the pewter gray of the surrounding sea, and it seemed to be swirling, slowly, deliberately, like thick porridge being stirred by an unseen, colossal hand. A young deckhand, barely a man, named Finian, pointed a trembling finger towards the port bow. His voice, usually boisterous, was a strangled whisper of pure, unadulterated terror. "Captain, look! The water," all eyes drawn by his raw fear, followed his gesture. About half a league distant, the sea was different. It was darker, a patch of inky blackness against the gray, and it seemed to be swirling slowly, deliberately, like thick porridge being stirred by an unseen hand. As they watched, mesmerized by a dread they could not yet name, the swirling intensified. The water in that area began to rise, not in a wave, but as a cohesive, monstrous mound. It rose with an unnatural slowness, a deliberate, ponderous ascent, as if the very seabed were pushing upwards. "By God's wounds," Captain Redmayne breathed, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the cutlass that never left his belt, though he knew deep in his gut that no steel could avail against this. What manner of devilry is this? The mound of water grew higher and higher, until it was a small hill upon the surface of the ocean, a dark, glistening dome. And then, from its peak, something began to emerge. At first, it looked like a series of jagged, dark rocks, glistening wetly in the dim light, perhaps the treacherous tips of a hidden reef. But no reef moved with such purpose. No reef pulsed with such an undeniable, terrifying semblance of life. These were not rocks. Slowly, agonizingly, the truth began to dawn upon the horrified crew of the Ironclad. The rocks were the barnacle-encrusted, seaweed-draped protuberances of a living creature, a creature of such impossible scale that their minds struggled to comprehend it. The sea around this emerging leviathan began to boil and churn, not with heat, but with the sheer displacement of its colossal bulk. It was a silent, frothing chaos, a testament to the unimaginable forces at play. And then, the bodies. Oh God, the bodies. Not a single, unified form, but a series of immense dark masses, interconnected by unseen sinews beneath the roiling surface. Like the writhing branches of some nightmare forest, they unfurled from the churning water. Each one was thicker than the Ironclad's main mast, a pillar of slick, dark muscle, tapering to a questing, intelligent tip. They rose higher and higher, a dozen or more, reaching towards the sky like supplicants to some dark, forgotten god, before beginning to arch and curve, their undersides revealing rows upon rows of suckers, each the size of a warrior's shield, each capable of gripping with a force that could pulverize stone. The air was now thick with that strange, rank odor, a stench of the deepest, darkest ocean trenches, a smell of ancient decay and raw, primal power. It was the scent of something that belonged to an age before man, a smell of abyssal pressure and sunless eons. The humming vibration intensified further, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very deck, up their legs, and into their skulls, making their teeth ache. The Ironclad, caught in the unnatural currents generated by the rising behemoth, began to drift slowly but inexorably towards the epicenter of the horror. Captain Redmayne roared, his voice finally breaking the spell of terrified silence that had gripped his crew. "To arms! Load the cannons! Prepare to repel boarders!" But it was a futile order, a desperate cry in the face of the unimaginable. What boarders could this be? What weapon could stand against this? The creature was still rising, its true form yet to be fully revealed, but already it dwarfed their vessel, casting a shadow that swallowed them whole. One of the colossal tentacles, glistening black and green with ancient slime, swept through the air with deceptive speed. It wasn't aimed at the ship, not yet, but but it passed so close that the wind of its passage tore at their clothes and stung their faces with icy spray. It crashed back into the sea with a sound like 1,000 cannons firing at once, sending a wave surging over their decks, nearly washing Finian overboard. The young sailor screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Another body, then another, began to move with more deliberate intent, their tips seeming to sniff the air, to taste the presence of the fragile wooden vessel and the warm-blooded life it contained. The central mass of the creature, a mountainous dome of flesh that defied any earthly comparison, was now fully visible, a living island of nightmare. And from somewhere within that colossal bulk, though they could not pinpoint its source, they felt more than heard a sound, a deep, resonant groaning, like the shifting of tectonic plates, or the sigh of a god stirring from an aeon-long slumber. It was the sound of something waking, and humanity was directly in its path. The monstrous form continued its slow, deliberate ascent, its multiple shifting bodies undulating with an impossible fluidity. The ironclad, a mere splinter of wood against this living mountain, was now directly in its shadow. The air thrummed with the creature's silent, crushing presence, and the stench of the abyss grew overpowering, a smell that scraped at the back of their throats and burned their eyes. Captain Redmayne, his face a mask of grim resolve that belied the terror coiling in his gut, knew there was only one course of action, however futile it might seem. They were men of war, and war was their only language against the unknown. Gunners, to your stations, load with solid shot, fire on my command. His voice, though strained, carried across the deck, cutting through the rising tide of panic. The crew, hardened by years of discipline and the unspoken code of the sea, moved with a desperate, practiced efficiency. They hauled the heavy cannonballs from their racks, rammed them down the muzzles of the ship's formidable culverins and demi-cannons. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the oceanic stench. Matches were lit, their small flames flickering wildly in the preternatural calm. Every man, from the youngest powder monkey to the oldest master gunner, worked with a furious intensity, their eyes fixed on the impossible horror that loomed before them. "Aim for the largest mass," Redmayne bellowed, his hand raised, signaling the fleet's other two ships, the Seahawk and the Vengeance, which also now wallowed in the oppressive stillness, their crews equally gripped by a terror that transcended the familiar. "Ready! Fire!" A thunderous roar ripped through the oppressive silence. Flame and smoke erupted from the ironclad's broadside, a blinding, deafening release of contained fury. Moments later, the Seahawk and Vengeance joined the chorus, their own cannons spitting fire. Solid iron shot, honed and heavy, tore through the air with a terrifying shriek, aimed directly at the colossal, undulating forms that dominated the horizon. The cannonballs, each weighing many pounds, struck true. They hit the dark, glistening surfaces of the entity, not with the expected crunch of splintering bone or the splash of displaced flesh, but with something far more unsettling. There was no impact, no recoil, no visible damage. The heavy iron shot simply passed through, or perhaps more accurately, they were absorbed. One moment, a cannonball was screaming towards the creature's mountainous bulk. The next, it was gone, swallowed by the dark, wet surface, without so much as a ripple. No splintering, no gore, no evidence of a tangible hit. It was as if they were firing at a mirage, a colossal, living shadow. The gunners, their faces blackened by powder smoke, stared in stunned disbelief. They reloaded, their movements faltering, their eyes wide with a dawning, soul-shattering horror. "Again!" Redmayne roared, his voice cracking with a desperate disbelief. "Fire again!" Again the cannons boomed, sending another volley of iron death towards the entity, and again the same impossible result. The cannonballs either vanished upon contact or passed clean through the shifting forms, leaving no mark, causing no reaction. It was as if the creature was not of this world, not subject to its laws of physics. It defied comprehension, defied destruction, A chilling, guttural moan rose from the ironclad's deck, a collective sound of utter despair and dawning madness. The enemy was untouchable. Their most potent weapons, the very instruments of their dominion over the waves, were useless. They were fighting something that did not believe in war, something that did not recognize their attacks, something that simply was. The entity continued its slow, ponderous movements, its multifaceted bodies shifting and coiling, oblivious to the desperate, futile rage of the human fleet. It was a predator, perhaps, but one that hunted not with fangs or claws, but with its very presence, its sheer, overwhelming, unassailable existence. The battle had begun, but it was a battle only one side was fighting. If you're finding yourself drawn into this chilling mystery, consider subscribing to the Maritime Chronicler. We delve into the deep, unearthing forgotten tales and existential dread from the abyss. Like this video to help us bring more of these forbidden stories to light, and join our crew as we navigate the truly unknown. The futility of their cannon fire hung in the air, heavier than the gunpowder smoke, more suffocating than the abyssal stench. The HMS Ironclad and her accompanying vessels, the Seahawk and the Vengeance, continued to wallow in the unnatural calm, their guns now silent, their crews frozen in a tableau of terrified disbelief. They had unleashed their fury, and the ocean's nightmare had simply endured. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense, for the entity did not retaliate. It did not charge, did not lash out with visible malice. Its movements were slow, ponderous, almost indifferent, yet utterly devastating. It was as if its very existence, its colossal, alien presence, was enough to shatter the fragile reality of the human ships. One of the immense multi-bodied forms, a section of its undulating mass, larger than a cathedral, began to shift. It rotated with agonizing slowness, its slick, dark surface glistening under the muted sky. As it turned, the sheer displacement of water created monstrous, silent currents. The ironclad, caught in this invisible maelstrom, was spun violently. Her oak timbers groaned, protesting with a sound like breaking bones. Men were thrown from their feet, sliding across the wet decks, their screams swallowed by the ominous hum that still resonated from the depths. Masts creaked dangerously, sails ripped further, and the ship listed heavily, water surging over her gunnels. This was not an attack, but a consequence. The creature did not intend to harm them. It simply existed on a scale so vast, so alien, that their presence was an insignificant irritation, their destruction an unintended side effect of its mere movement. From the Seahawk, anchored closer to the entity's core, a new horror unfolded. One of the colossal, tentacle-like protuberances, thick as a dragon's neck, began to move. It wasn't a strike, not a deliberate lunge. Instead, it slowly, almost lazily, rose from the water, its suckers, each the size of a man's head, glistening wetly. Then, with the slow, inexorable force of a continental plate shifting, it simply rested upon the Seahawk's mainmast. There was no sudden crash, no explosive splintering, just a prolonged, horrifying groan that echoed across the water, a sound of immense pressure meeting brittle wood. The mast, stout and proud, began to buckle, to splinter, to deform under the unimaginable weight. Then, with a sound like a rifle shot magnified 1,000 times, it snapped. The mast, with its tattered sails and the terrified lookout still clinging to its rigging, toppled slowly into the churning water, a catastrophic ruin. The Seahawk lurched, her balance gone, her deck a chaos of snapping ropes and flailing men. The entity's bodies continued their slow, rhythmic undulations, their forms shifting, merging, and separating beneath the surface. It was a fluid, non-Euclidean geometry, a nightmare made manifest. The Vengeance, attempting a desperate, futile maneuver to escape the radiating currents, found itself caught in a different, equally terrifying phenomenon. The water beneath her hull began to bulge upwards, not a wave, but a silent, liquid mountain rising from below. The ship was lifted slowly, precariously, into the air, her keel exposed to the dim, bruised light. For a heart-stopping moment, the Vengeance hung suspended high above the water, a dark silhouette against the monstrous living mound. Then, with a sickening crack, her keel broke. The ship fractured along her spine, splitting into two halves. A chorus of horrified screams erupted from her crew as the two sections, still held aloft for a moment by the rising water, slid downwards, one to port, one to starboard, plunging into the depths with a colossal, gurgling splash. The sea closed over them, leaving only a widening circle of debris and a few struggling, terrified men. Captain Redmayne watched from the ironclad's deck, his heart a stone in his chest. His fleet, the pride of the King's Navy, was being undone, not by cannon fire or boarding parties, but by the sheer, unthinking, devastating presence of something truly alien. There was no malice in the creature's movements, no discernible intelligence, just a relentless, overwhelming power that crushed and consumed without intent. It was like trying to fight the tide or the shifting of the earth itself. They were not being attacked, they were being erased. The horrifying realization settled over him like a shroud. This was not a war. This was merely an encounter, and humanity was the insignificant, perishable element. The destruction of the Vengeance, so swift and absolute, shattered any remaining illusion of control. The HMS Ironclad was now alone, a solitary, battered vessel in a sea that had transformed into a theater of the impossible. The colossal, multi-bodied entity continued its slow, indifferent movements, its sheer scale and the raw power of its presence, turning the very elements into weapons against the remaining ship. Captain Redmayne, his face grim, barked orders, his voice raw. Cut the mainmast. Any sail still standing, cut it free. Prepare to abandon ship if necessary. It was a desperate, unheard-of command, a capitulation that went against every fiber of his being as a naval officer. But to remain was to invite the same fate as the Vengeance. To fight was to embrace an unwinnable, incomprehensible doom. The crew, though trembling with fear, scrambled to obey. Axes flashed, ropes were severed, and the tattered remnants of the ironclad's sails, already torn by the inexplicable forces, were hacked away. The mainmast, weakened by the earlier inexplicable currents, groaned and swayed, threatening to fall. But even as they toiled, the sea around them continued its unnatural behavior. The water, still dark and oily, began to churn with a silent internal agitation directly beneath the ironclad's keel. A low, grinding sound, like colossal stones being dragged across the seabed, resonated through the hull, vibrating up their legs, making their teeth ache. It was not the sound of scraping rock, but something deeper, more organic, a sound of immense, unseen bulk shifting beneath them. The ship began to groan, her timbers screaming in protest, as if a giant, unseen hand were slowly, deliberately twisting her from below. "Hold fast!" Redmayne roared, gripping the splintered rail, his knuckles white. He could feel the deck beneath his feet beginning to warp, to buckle. The ironclad was being squeezed, compressed by an invisible force, her stout frame groaning under a pressure that defied the ocean's known laws. The few remaining men from the Seahawk, those who had survived its mass collapse, were now struggling in the water, their desperate cries barely audible above the low, resonant hum emanating from the entity. They thrashed, their faces pale with terror, some attempting to swim towards the ironclad, others simply flailing in the oily, dark water, caught in the strange currents. But the entity, in its slow, unknowable movements, was drawing them closer, not to consume them, but merely to incorporate them into the vast, churning chaos of its immediate vicinity. One by one, their cries ceased, swallowed by the depths, their forms disappearing beneath the shifting surface. Redmayne knew then that retreat was their only desperate hope. Survival was no longer about victory, but about escape. "To the longboats!" he bellowed, his voice hoarse. "Lower the longboats, now!" The order, though chaotic, was met with a desperate urgency. Men scrambled, some slipping on the heaving deck, others fighting their way through the oppressive, vibrating air. The two longboats, usually lowered with practiced precision, were dropped with a crash into the water, their lines fraying. Men tumbled in, some wounded, some screaming, all consumed by a primal urge to flee. Redmayne was among the last to descend, his eyes fixed on the monstrous forms that continued their silent, devastating dance. He saw the ironclad itself, his beloved ship, beginning to succumb to the immense pressure from below. Her hull was visibly deforming, plates of oak splintering, water beginning to gush into her holds. She was being crushed, slowly and inexorably, by the entity's unseen embrace. As his longboat pulled away, propelled by the desperate, ragged strokes of the oarsmen, Redmayne cast one last look back. The ironclad, her back broken, was sinking, not dramatically, but with a slow, mournful dignity, her stern lifting, her bow dipping into the dark, oily water. Above her, the colossal, multi-bodied entity continued its silent, indifferent movements, its forms shifting, its presence an unassailable reality that swallowed ships and men without effort or intent. It was a retreat born of terror, a flight from something that defied all known understanding, leaving behind only wreckage and the chilling, ceaseless hum that now seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the sea. The survivors, few and broken, rode for their lives, their minds scarred by the impossible, their souls forever haunted by the silent, unyielding horror that dwelled in the depths. They had witnessed the unimaginable, and it had left them profoundly, irrevocably changed. The longboats, two fragile splinters of wood upon an indifferent ocean, pulled away from the dying HMS Ironclad, the sight of their flagship, the pride of the fleet, groaning and breaking apart under the silent alien pressure, was a torment worse than any physical wound. Captain Redmayne, though in the lead longboat, felt the weight of every lost soul, every splinter of wood, every shattered certainty. His face, usually a mask of granite resolve, was now etched with a profound, almost spiritual, despair. He watched as the ironclad slid beneath the waves, her last mast tilting skyward like a defiant finger before she was swallowed whole by the bruised, churning water. There was no grand explosion, no final dramatic plunge, just a slow, mournful descent, as if the sea itself were sighing, claiming its due. And above the spot where she vanished, the colossal, multi-bodied entity continued its slow, ponderous undulations, its forms shifting and merging, an unassailable, indifferent monument to human futility. The surviving men, a mere handful from a once proud complement, rode with a desperate, ragged rhythm, their eyes wide and haunted. They dared not look back, but the memory of what they had seen was seared into their minds. The cannonballs vanishing, the Seahawk dismasted by an unseen hand, the Vengeance snapped like a twig. They were escaping, but from what? From a battle they couldn't fight, against an enemy that didn't acknowledge their existence. As the longboat strained towards the distant, hazy shoreline, the hum that had permeated the air began to recede, fading slowly, agonizingly, like a phantom limb's ache. The oily patches on the water gradually dispersed, and the sea, with a chilling swiftness, began to return to its unsettling calm. It was as if the abyssal entity had merely stretched, yawned, and then settled back into its eternal slumber, leaving behind only devastation and unanswered questions. Redmayne, however, was not yet done. Even as the longboat pitched and rolled, his mind, though reeling, clung to a single, desperate imperative: to record, to bear witness. The king would demand answers, the admiralty would dissect every detail, but more than that, his very soul demanded an attempt to grasp the incomprehensible, to distill the horror into words. He reached into his oilskin coat, his hand fumbling for the small, leather-bound ship's logbook and a stub of charcoal. The logbook, a mundane record of winds and tides and provisions, suddenly became a sacred text, the last testament of a world shattered. His hands, though calloused from years of rope and timber, trembled as he opened it to the last blank page. The flickering light of a lantern held by a still shaking Finian cast dancing shadows as Redmayne began to write. His initial entries were terse, factual, describing the calm, the hum, the emergence. He wrote of the cannon fire, the impossible lack of effect. His hand paused then, hovering over the page, his brow furrowed in a profound, agonizing struggle. How to describe what had no name? How to explain a foe that was not a foe, but a force of nature so alien it defied even the concept of conflict? He dipped the charcoal, pressed it to the page, and slowly, deliberately, formed the words that would haunt scholars for centuries. Words that would become the chilling cornerstone of a forbidden mystery. We fired. It absorbed. It did not strike. It merely was. It does not believe in our war. It does not understand our rage. It moves, and we are broken. We are nothing. His gaze drifted to the distant, receding forms of the entity, still visible as dark smudges against the horizon, slowly sinking back into the depths from which they had emerged. He thought of the men, swallowed by the sea, not by the sword, not by the storm, but by a silent, unthinking power. He thought of the king's ships, reduced to splinters and ghosts. With a final, desperate resolve, his hand returned to the logbook. He added the last, most chilling line, a testament not just to the day's horror, but to a profound, existential despair. We tried to fight something that does not believe in war. He closed the logbook, the leather cover feeling impossibly heavy in his hands. The battle was over. The retreat was underway. But the war against the unknowable, had just begun. He looked at Finian, the young man's eyes still wide with shock. "Keep this safe, lad," Redmayne rasped, pressing the logbook into his trembling hands. "It is all that remains." He knew that the true horror was not just what they had seen, but the dawning realization that the world was infinitely vaster and infinitely more terrifying than they had ever dared to imagine, and that humanity, for all its cannons and its pride, was but a fragile, perishable speck upon an ancient, indifferent abyss. The return journey was a blur of terror and exhaustion. The two longboats carrying the few surviving men from the three proud ships limped towards the nearest English port, a small, unremarkable fishing village along the Sussex coast. Their arrival was met not with the expected cheers of triumph, but with gasps of horror and disbelief. Sunken eyes, faces etched with an unspeakable dread, and the chilling whispered tales of an enemy that was no enemy. This was the grim harvest of the rocks of Dolor. Captain Redmayne, though physically unharmed, was a broken man. His spirit, once unyielding, had been shattered by the impossible. He delivered his report to the local Admiralty representative, a portly, skeptical bureaucrat who listened with a growing mixture of impatience and thinly veiled contempt. An unknown entity, moving without sails, cannonballs passing through. The questions dripped with disbelief, the implication clear. Captain Redmayne, a man of renown, had lost his mind, or worse, his courage, but the evidence, however bizarre, was undeniable. Two king's ships were gone. The ironclad was a phantom, and the few surviving men, though incoherent with trauma, all spoke of the same impossible phenomenon. The sheer scale of the loss, coupled with the utterly inexplicable nature of the event, sent ripples of alarm through the Admiralty. Such a thing, if widely known, could shatter morale, sow panic, and undermine the very authority of the Crown over its seas. The response was swift, brutal, and utterly predictable: suppression. Official reports were immediately classified, sealed under the highest possible decree. The incident was to be attributed to an unprecedented and localized storm, a natural disaster, however improbable. The men, the few who had survived, were debriefed, their accounts meticulously recorded, then dispersed. Some were pensioned off, their silence bought with coin, and the threat of the king's displeasure. Others were reassigned to distant, isolated outposts, their haunted eyes and whispered tales dismissed as the ravings of shell-shocked sailors. Finian, the young deckhand who carried Redmayne's logbook, found himself reassigned to a remote lighthouse, far from any shipping lanes, his precious burden confiscated and locked away in a forgotten archive. Captain Redmayne himself, a man too prominent to simply vanish, was officially declared to have suffered a grievous injury and retired from service. He spent his remaining days in a small coastal cottage, staring out at the very sea that had betrayed his understanding, his mind a prisoner of the unspeakable. His final log entry, with its chilling declaration, was deemed the ravings of a man unhinged by battle, an anomaly to be ignored. And the site itself, the craggy, remote stretch of coastline where the impossible had occurred, was quickly and quietly declared off-limits. Official charts were updated with new, ominous warnings: dangerous shoals, unpredictable currents, frequent and severe squalls. The area was given a new, foreboding name, one that would echo with the trauma of that day: the Rocks of Dolor. Fishermen were warned away, their ancient knowledge of fishing grounds overridden by stern naval decrees. Patrols were increased, not to guard against invasion, but to ensure no one ventured too close. No one stumbled upon the lingering secret. For centuries, the story of the sea battle at the Rocks of Dolor became a ghost story, whispered in hushed tones among old salts, a tale dismissed as drunken fantasy by the educated. The official narrative held firm: a storm, nothing more. But the whispers persisted, carried on the salt wind from one generation of mariners to the next. Tales of an unnatural calm, of something rising from the deep, of cannonballs that failed to strike. The men who had been there, those few who lived long enough to tell their children, never spoke of it loudly, never in polite company. But their eyes, those haunted, distant eyes, told a different story. A story of a day when the ocean revealed its true, terrifying face, and humanity learned the brutal truth that there were powers in the abyss that did not care for their wars, their ships, or their very existence. And the secret, buried deep in classified files and forgotten minds, lay waiting for its moment to resurface. Centuries passed. The age of sail gave way to steam, then to diesel. Empires rose and fell. Yet the official decree regarding the Rocks of Dolor remained in effect, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. Navigational charts, updated countless times, still bore the vague warnings of dangerous shoals and unpredictable currents, a convenient fiction to mask a deeper, far more unsettling truth. Modern vessels, with their advanced sonar and satellite navigation, generally avoided the area, not out of fear of ancient monsters, but simply because it was considered economically unviable, a dead zone for fishing or shipping. But the sea, as the old chroniclers knew, forgets nothing, and certain places, once touched by the truly anomalous, retain an echo of the events that transpired there. For decades, scattered reports began to filter into the scientific community, anecdotal at first, then more frequent, more consistent. Fishermen, daring to venture closer to the forbidden zone in search of dwindling catches, spoke of strange phenomena, not of monstrous sightings, but of something far more subtle, more insidious. They spoke of a constant hum, a low, resonant thrumming sound that seemed to emanate not from the air, nor from any man-made source, but from within the very water itself. It was a sound that vibrated through their hulls, through their very bones, a deep, subaudible frequency that over time caused headaches, nausea, and a profound sense of unease. It was as if the Battle of 1271, the silent, unreciprocated conflict, was still being fought, not on the surface, but deep within the water itself, a ceaseless, mournful echo of a primordial pulse. This was no mere acoustic anomaly. The hum was localized, strongest at the precise coordinates where the ironclad and her sister ships had met their impossible end, and it was accompanied by other strange, localized maritime anomalies. Compasses would spin wildly, their needles refusing to settle. Sonar readings would return distorted, impossible images, sometimes depicting vast, shifting masses beneath the seabed that defied geological explanation, only to vanish moments later. Electronic equipment would fritz and fail. Even the behavior of marine life in the area was peculiar, a notable absence of large migratory species, and a strange, almost unnatural stillness among the smaller fish. It was these persistent, perplexing reports that eventually caught the attention of Dr. Eleanor Vance, a leading researcher in marine acoustics and abyssal geology from the Oceanographic Institute at Woods Hole. Dr. Vance was known for her meticulous approach and her unwavering skepticism. She dismissed the early anecdotal reports as misread equipment or mass hysteria among superstitious fishermen. But the sheer volume and consistency of the data, once she began to aggregate it, became impossible to ignore. Her initial expedition to the rocks of Dolor was funded by a small, independent grant, largely dismissed by her peers as a wild goose chase. She deployed an array of sophisticated hydrophones, deep-sea sensors, and geological probes. What she found defied all conventional scientific explanation. The hum was real. It was a consistent, ultra-low frequency vibration, unlike anything she had ever recorded. It pulsed with a strange, organic rhythm, almost like a colossal heartbeat, yet too deep, too vast to be biological in any known sense. The data is perplexing, Dr. Vance stated in a recently declassified preliminary report, her voice betraying a hint of the awe that had replaced her initial skepticism. We're registering seismic activity that doesn't correspond to any known fault lines. The subsurface sonar returns are inconsistent. Sometimes it's as if there's nothing there. Other times, it's a vast, non-reflective mass, too large to be a conventional geological formation. It appears to shift, to undulate, even as we record it. Her research also uncovered the long-buried Admiralty reports from 1271, stumbled upon in a forgotten corner of the National Archives. The chilling log entry of Captain Redmayne, dismissed for centuries as lunacy, suddenly resonated with an unsettling clarity. We tried to fight something that does not believe in war. It was a phrase that now echoed in Dr. Vance's mind as she listened to the ceaseless, silent hum emanating from the deep. The rocks of Dolor, once a mere point on a map, then a site of official suppression, was now a place of profound scientific mystery. The hum, the anomalies, the historical account, they all pointed to something vast, ancient, and utterly alien, still dwelling beneath the waves. Something that perhaps, even after centuries, was still stirring, still dreaming, still pulsing with the very essence of its existence. A constant, low-frequency reminder of the day humanity encountered the truly unknowable. Dr. Eleanor Vance's findings, though meticulously documented and peer-reviewed, sparked as much controversy as they did enlightenment. The scientific community grappled with the implications of her data, a persistent, inexplicable hum, anomalous seismic readings, and shifting, non-reflective masses beneath the seabed of the rocks of Dolor. Coupled with the unearthed historical accounts of Captain Redmayne, the mystery deepened into something truly profound. What then could explain such an impossible confluence of events spanning centuries? One plausible scientific hypothesis revolves around rare geomorphic phenomena. The deep ocean floor is a realm of constant geological activity, often hidden from human observation. Could the rocks of Dolor be the site of a unique, perhaps cyclical, deep-sea volcanic vent system that releases ultra-low frequency vibrations? Perhaps an unusual configuration of underwater caverns and currents could create a massive, resonating chamber, amplifying natural seismic activity into the persistent hum. The shifting, non-reflective masses detected by sonar could be vast, temporary formations of superheated water or gas, rapidly changing density and shape, creating the illusion of a living entity. Such phenomena, while rare, are not entirely beyond the realm of possibility, especially in an ocean largely unexplored. Another hypothesis leans towards deep-sea bioluminescent life and unique ecological systems. The abyss is home to creatures that defy imagination, many of which use bioluminescence for communication, hunting, or defense. Could the 1271 entity have been an unimaginably vast, multi-organismal colony of deep-sea life, rising from the lightless depths? Its shifting, indistinct forms, its non-reaction to cannon fire, perhaps due to a semi-liquid or gaseous composition, and its ability to absorb impact could be characteristics of a life form utterly alien to surface dwellers. The hum could be a form of echolocation or communication from such a colossal biological entity, a sound too low for human ears to consciously register, but capable of vibrating through a ship's hull. The multiple bodies reported by Redmayne could simply be different sections of a single, sprawling superorganism, or perhaps a symbiotic collective. Then there are the psychological and historical roots. The year 1271 was a time of immense superstition and limited scientific understanding. Sailors were already prone to interpreting the unknown through the lens of myth and divine wrath. Mass hysteria, fueled by the sudden terrifying calm and the inexplicable vibrations, could have led to a collective hallucination or misinterpretation of a natural event. The mind, under extreme duress, can conjure visions that seem undeniably real. Captain Redmayne's chilling log entry, "We tried to fight something that does not believe in war," could be interpreted as the desperate attempt of a rational mind to make sense of an irrational, overwhelming experience, attributing a profound philosophical indifference to a natural force that simply was. Furthermore, the very act of Sankey's official suppression in 1271 could have amplified the legend. By classifying the event by dismissing the witnesses, the Crown inadvertently cemented the mystery. The whispers, the forbidden knowledge, became more potent precisely because they were denied. The incident, therefore, became a powerful narrative, passed down through generations, its core truth shrouded in layers of fear and secrecy. Finally, and perhaps most unsettlingly, there's the tantalizing, almost philosophical idea that what Captain Redmayne encountered was a manifestation of an ancient, pre-human intelligence. Not a creature in the biological sense, but something far older, far more fundamental, dwelling in the ocean's abyssal plains. An entity that exists on a different plane of being, interacting with our reality only incidentally. Its movements, causing localized distortions in space-time or energy fields, which our primitive weapons simply could not comprehend or affect. The hum, then, would be its resting breath, its constant low-frequency presence, a reminder that humanity is but a fleeting visitor on a planet that harbors secrets far older and more profound than our brief history. Dr. Vance, in her later, more speculative papers, acknowledged the limitations of purely scientific explanation. We can measure the frequencies, map the anomalies, but the essence of what occurred in 1271 remains elusive, she wrote. It's as if the ocean, on that day, chose to reveal a truth about itself, a truth so vast and so alien that our instruments and our minds are simply not equipped to fully grasp it. The rocks of Dolor remain a site of active research, a constant humming enigma, a perpetual reminder that the deep, silent ocean holds not just wonders, but perhaps the very essence of the unknowable. The Sea Battle at the Rocks of Dolor, a name that echoes with the impossible, a story that bridges the chasm between documented history and the darkest corners of myth. From the desperate, futile cannons of Captain Redmayne's fleet in 1271, fighting an entity that does not believe in war, to the ceaseless, low-frequency hum that still emanates from those forbidden waters today, the mystery endures. Was it a unique geological event? A fleeting glimpse into the raw, indifferent power of our planet's hidden mechanisms? Could it have been an unimaginable deep-sea superorganism, a form of life so alien that our very concept of biology fails to encompass it? Or perhaps, as the most unsettling whispers suggest, was it an encounter with something far more ancient, a primordial intelligence, stirring from aeons of slumber, its movements merely brushing against the fragile fabric of our reality? The ocean's depths, my friends, are a realm of breathtaking beauty and terrifying mystery. For centuries, it has spawned legends of colossal beasts and spectral terrors, but some tales, like that of the Rocks of Dolor, transcend mere folklore. They tap into a primal fear, a dawning realization that beneath the waves, in the crushing dark, there are things that defy our understanding, forces that operate on scales, and principles we can barely begin to comprehend. The hum from the Rocks of Dolor is a siren song, a constant chilling reminder that we are not alone on this blue marble, and that the abyss still holds secrets that could shatter our world. What do you believe happened at the Rocks of Dolor? Was it a natural phenomenon misidentified, a collective hallucination, or something truly, existentially terrifying? Share your theories in the comments below. And if this journey into the profound unknowns of the deep has stirred your soul, remember to like this video and subscribe to the Maritime Chronicler. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon, but never forget what might be stirring beneath the waves.